The dust from the trail had long since turned to mud in her mouth, and Josephine Harper's feet screamed with every step she took along the mountain pass, her worn-out boots more whole than leather now after 20 miles of unforgiving terrain through the Oklahoma wilderness in the summer of 1878. She had left her brother's homestead outside Fort Smith, Arkansas, 3 days ago, with nothing but a canvas bag, those terrible boots, and a heart full of desperate determination to reach her aunt in Muskogee before the bank took everything the woman owned. The stagecoach money she had saved for months had been stolen right from her room the night before departure, and waiting another month meant her aunt would lose the mercantile that had been in their family for 2 generations. So Josephine had set out on foot, following the trails that wound through the wooded hills and valleys, rationing the little food she had, sleeping under trees, and pushing her body far beyond what it was meant to endure. Now, as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly and the final stretch of road wavered before her eyes, she stumbled. Her ankle twisted, pain shooting up her leg, and she fell hard onto the packed earth. Tears of frustration burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had come so far. Muskogee was just over the next ridge, perhaps a mile away. She could see the smoke from the town's chimneys rising in the distance. Josephine tried to stand, but her legs simply would not obey. They trembled violently, muscles spent beyond recovery. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her face sunburned beneath the bonnet that hung limp and useless around her neck. She had run out of water that morning, and the creek she had hoped to find had been nothing but a dry bed of rocks. "Get up," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse. "Just get up." But she could not. Her body had finally given out. The sound of horse hooves on the trail made her lift her head. Through the haze of exhaustion, she saw a massive figure riding toward her on a dark bay horse, leading a pack mule behind. As the rider drew closer, she could make out more details. He was enormous, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle, his chest straining against a worn leather vest. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of raw hide, and his face was weathered and tanned from years in the sun. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, a startling shade of blue-green, fixed on her with immediate concern. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, moving with surprising grace for a man his size. Josephine guessed he stood well over 6 feet, perhaps 6'4", and his arms were corded with the kind of strength that came from hard living in the wilderness. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble as he knelt beside her, "what in God's name are you doing out here alone?" Josephine tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She managed only a croak. The mountain man did not waste time with more questions. He pulled a canteen from his belt and supported her head gently with one massive hand, tipping water carefully into her mouth. "Slow now," he murmured, "not too much at once." The water was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. After a few sips, he pulled it away despite her protests. "More in a minute," he promised. "Let that settle first. Can you tell me your name?" "Josephine," she managed. "Josephine Harper. I need to get to Muskogee. My aunt is there. I have to reach her before Friday." The man glanced at the sun, then back at her. "Today is Thursday, and you are in no condition to walk another step. Those feet of yours are bleeding through your boots." She looked down and was startled to see he was right. Dark stains had seeped through the worn leather. "I will make it," she said stubbornly, trying again to rise. "I have to." He caught her easily as she swayed, and she found herself steadied against a chest that felt like a stone wall. "You will make it," he agreed, "but not on those feet. I am headed to Muskogee myself. I will take you there." "I cannot pay you," Josephine said, hating how weak her voice sounded. "Did I ask for payment?" He studied her face, and something in his expression softened. "You have walked yourself nearly to death, Miss Harper. Let someone help you for once." Before she could protest further, he scooped her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. Josephine gasped, instinctively gripping his shoulders. The muscle beneath her hands was solid and warm, and despite her exhausted state, she felt her cheeks flush. "I can ride," she protested weakly. "Not with those feet, and not in your condition. Muskogee is only a mile from here. I will carry you." "That is absurd. I'm too heavy." The corner of his mouth twitched, though she could not quite call it a smile. "Miss Harper, I have carried full-grown elk down mountains. I assure you, you are no burden." He set her carefully on his horse, then mounted behind her with fluid ease, gathering her back against his chest and wrapping one powerful arm around her waist to keep her secure. The pack mule's lead rope was tied to his saddle, and with a gentle click of his tongue, they started forward. Josephine had not realized how cold she had been until she felt the warmth radiating from his body. She tried to hold herself stiffly, maintaining some sense of propriety, but exhaustion won out, and she sagged against him. "Rest," he said quietly. "You are safe now." "I do not even know your name," she murmured. "Dalton Quinn." "Thank you, Mr. Quinn. Just Dalton is fine. I'm not much for formalities." Despite everything, despite her pain and exhaustion and the strangeness of being held in the arms of a mountain man she had just met, Josephine felt safe. His heartbeat was steady against her back, his arms secure around her waist, and the gentle rocking motion of the horse began to lull her into a daze. "Why were you walking alone?" Dalton asked after a few minutes. "This country is not safe for unescorted women." Josephine explained about the stolen money, about her aunt facing foreclosure, about having no choice but to make the journey on foot. As she spoke, she felt his arm tighten slightly around her. "That was brave," he said when she finished. "Also incredibly foolish, but brave. I had no other option. There is always another option. You could have died out here. Then I would have died trying." She tilted her head back to look at him and found his eyes already on her. Up close, they were even more striking, flecked with gold and green around the pupils. "Some things are worth the risk." Something flickered in his expression, something she could not quite read. "I suppose they are," he said softly. They rode in silence for a while. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The woods around them were alive with the sounds of evening birds and insects, and a warm breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. "What brings you to Muskogee?" Josephine asked, needing to fill the silence that had grown too comfortable between them. "Supplies, mostly. I have a cabin up in the mountains, about 15 miles north of town. I come down every few weeks to trade furs and stock up on things I cannot make or catch myself." "You live alone?" "I do now. My partner, old Samuel Greywolf, passed 2 winters ago. Since then, it has just been me in the wilderness." "That sounds lonely." Dalton was quiet for a moment. "It can be, but it is peaceful too. No politics, no crowds, no expectations, just the land and the seasons and the work." "Do you never wish for companionship?" He shifted slightly in the saddle. "Sometimes. But the kind of life I live is not suited to most people. It is hard work from dawn until dusk, isolated, sometimes dangerous. Not many would choose it willingly. But you do." "I do." There was conviction in his voice. "I was a soldier once, served in the war. After that, I tried living in cities, tried being what people expected. It nearly killed me. The mountains gave me peace when nothing else could." Josephine understood that more than he probably realized. She had spent her whole life meeting other people's expectations, being the dutiful daughter, the helpful sister, the proper lady. This wild journey, as desperate as it had been, was the first truly independent thing she had ever done. "I think I understand that," she said quietly. The buildings of Muskogee began to appear ahead, first scattered homesteads, then more densely packed structures as they entered the edge of town. It was a modest settlement, built along the banks of the Arkansas River, with a main street lined with businesses and a church steeple rising above the other buildings. Despite its size, it bustled with activity, even as evening approached. "Where does your aunt live?" Dalton asked. "She owns the Mercantile on Main Street, Harper's General Store." "I know it. Mrs. Eleanor Harper, right? I've bought supplies there before." "That is her. She's my father's sister. She and her husband ran the store together for 20 years, but he died of pneumonia last winter. She has been struggling to manage alone." Dalton guided his horse down the main street, drawing curious looks from passers-by. Josephine knew they must make an odd picture, her bedraggled and dusty in his arms, him looking like he had stepped out of the wilderness itself. She tried not to think about the gossip this would generate. The Mercantile was a sturdy 2-story building with living quarters above the shop. Dalton dismounted and then carefully lifted Josephine down, but when her feet touched the ground, she cried out in pain and would have collapsed if he had not caught her. "Easy," he said, and without asking permission, he swept her back up into his arms. "Which door?" "There's a side entrance that leads to the upstairs." He carried her around the building and up the narrow stairs, pushing open the door at the top when Josephine managed to turn the handle. Inside was a small, tidy apartment with a sitting area, kitchen, and 2 bedrooms visible through open doors. "Josephine?" a woman's voice called out from one of the bedrooms, and a moment later, Eleanor Harper appeared. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked brown hair and a face that bore a strong resemblance to Josephine's. Her eyes widened in shock. "Dear Lord, what happened?" "She walked from Fort Smith," Dalton said simply, carrying Josephine to the settee and laying her down gently. "Near 20 miles today alone, I would wager. Her feet are badly damaged and she is severely dehydrated." Eleanor rushed to her niece's side, her hand flying to her mouth as she took in Josephine's condition. "You foolish, foolish girl. Why did you not wait for the next stage?" "The bank," Josephine whispered. "Friday, I had to get here." Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes, followed by tears. "Oh, Josie, you should not have done this, not for the store. You are family. What else would I do?" Dalton had stepped back, giving them space, but Eleanor turned to him with gratitude shining on her face. "Thank you for bringing her home safely, Mr. Quinn. I recognize you from the store. I cannot express how grateful I am." "No thanks necessary, madam, but she needs proper medical attention. Those feet need to be cleaned and bandaged, and she should drink plenty of water and have something with salt." "I will fetch Dr. Morrison at once," Eleanor said, standing. She paused at the door. "Will you stay while I am gone? I do not want to leave her alone." Dalton nodded. "I will stay." After Eleanor hurried out, Dalton pulled a chair close to the settee and sat down, his large frame making the furniture look almost comically small. He poured water from a pitcher on a nearby table and held it to Josephine's lips. "Drink more," he instructed. "Slowly." She obeyed, too tired to argue. When she had taken several sips, he set the glass aside and studied her with those intense eyes. "You are either the bravest woman I have ever met, or the most stubborn," he said. "Cannot I be both?" A genuine smile crossed his face then, transforming his stern features into something warmer. "I suppose you can." "You did not have to stay," Josephine said. "I'm sure you have things to do." "Nothing that cannot wait. Besides, I want to make sure you are properly cared for. You do not even know me." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze holding hers. "No, but I would like to." Something in the way he said it made Josephine's breath catch. There was an intensity to this man, a directness that was both unsettling and thrilling. She was accustomed to the coded language of polite society, where nothing was said plainly and everything was wrapped in layers of propriety. Dalton Quinn spoke like he lived, she suspected, honestly and without pretense. "Why?" she asked. "Because anyone willing to walk themselves nearly to death for family is someone worth knowing. Because when I asked why you were doing something so dangerous, you did not make excuses or cry or expect to be rescued. You stated facts and kept moving forward." He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "Because when I picked you up, you did not swoon or simper. You told me you could ride." Despite her exhaustion and pain, Josephine laughed. "I apologize for not being a proper damsel in distress." "Do not apologize. The world has too many proper damsels. It could use more women like you." Before she could respond, Eleanor returned with Dr. Morrison, a portly man in his 60s with kind eyes and efficient hands. Dalton stepped outside while the doctor examined her, but Eleanor asked him to wait. The examination was painful, and Josephine bit her lip to keep from crying out as the doctor removed her boots and began cleaning the torn, blistered feet. He shook his head throughout, making disapproving noises. "You are lucky you did not get infection," he said, applying salve to the worst of the wounds. "These need to be kept clean and dry. No walking for at least a week, possibly 2. "But I cannot stay that long," Josephine protested. "I have responsibilities at home." "You have responsibilities to your own health, young lady. Push too hard now, and you will cause permanent damage." He began wrapping her feet in clean bandages. "Mrs. Harper, make sure she stays off these feet. Light broth tonight, then regular meals tomorrow. Plenty of water. If you notice any signs of fever, or if the wounds show red streaking, send for me immediately." After the doctor left, Eleanor prepared a simple broth while Dalton sat with Josephine again. The apartment felt smaller with him in it, his presence somehow filling more space than his physical size alone could account for. "I should let you rest," he said after a while, though he made no move to leave. "When do you return to your cabin?" Josephine asked. "I will stay in town tonight, head back tomorrow after I finish my business." He hesitated. "If it is all right with you and your aunt, I would like to check on you before I leave. Make sure you are recovering well." "I would like that," Josephine said, and meant it. When Eleanor brought the broth, Dalton stood and moved toward the door. He paused there, his hand on the frame, and looked back at her. "You have more strength than most men I know, Josephine Harper. I hope you remember that when you are feeling frustrated about staying still for a week." "Thank you, Dalton," she said softly, "for everything." He nodded once and then was gone, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Eleanor sat beside her niece, helping her with the broth and watching her with concerned eyes. "That's quite a man who found you," she said carefully. "He is," Josephine agreed, not meeting her aunt's gaze. "You should know that he has something of a reputation in town." That made Josephine look up. "What kind of reputation?" "Nothing bad, do not worry. He's known as honest and fair in his dealings, never cheats, always pays his debts. But he is also known as solitary and somewhat fierce. There was an incident a couple of years ago where 3 men tried to rob him when he came to town with a season's worth of furs. He put all 3 in the doctor's office without drawing the knife he carries." Josephine thought about the gentle way he had held her, the careful way he had given her water. "He was nothing but kind to me." "I am sure he was. I just want you to understand that he is not like the young men you are accustomed to. He lives a hard life in a hard place. Do not mistake gratitude for something more, dear one." But as Josephine lay in the guest bedroom later that night, her bandaged feet propped on pillows and her body finally clean and comfortable, it was not gratitude that made her replay every moment of being held in Dalton Quinn's arms. It was not gratitude that made her remember the sound of his voice or the way he had looked at her when he said he wanted to know her better. She told herself she was being foolish. They had met only hours ago under desperate circumstances. Come morning, he would finish his business and return to his mountain, and she would recover and eventually return to Fort Smith. Their paths had crossed for a brief moment, and that was all it was meant to be. But sleep was long in coming, and when it finally did, she dreamed of blue-green eyes and strong arms and the scent of pine trees. Morning came with golden sunlight streaming through the window and the sounds of the town waking below. Josephine's feet throbbed with a dull, constant ache, but it was bearable compared to yesterday's agony. Eleanor brought her breakfast in bed and fussed over her, and they talked about the situation with the bank. "Thani too." "The payment is due tomorrow by noon," Eleanor explained, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I have been scrambling to gather the funds, but I am still $30 short. I thought I would have to sell everything and close the store, but then I received a letter from your mother saying you were coming with money she had scraped together. I have been watching for the stage every day." Josephine's heart sank. "I had $50 saved. It was stolen the night before I was meant to leave." "I'm so sorry, Aunt Eleanor. I came anyway because I thought I could help some other way, maybe convince the bank to extend the deadline." Eleanor took her hand and squeezed it. "You nearly killed yourself trying to reach me. That is more than I could ever ask. We will figure something out. Perhaps Mr. Carlson at the bank will be understanding." "When is the last time a banker was understanding?" Josephine said bitterly. They were still discussing options when someone knocked at the door. Eleanor went to answer it and returned a moment later with Dalton Quinn behind her. He looked different in the morning light, somehow larger and more solid. His hair was damp as though he had recently bathed, and he carried his hat in his hands. "Good morning," he said, his eyes finding Josephine immediately. "I wanted to check on you before I headed to the bank." "The bank?" Eleanor said, surprised. "I need to deposit payment for the furs I sold yesterday. Took in a good amount this season." He approached the bed, his gaze moving over Josephine's face as though assessing her condition. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Josephine said. "Sore, but better, Thank you for asking." He nodded, seeming satisfied. "Good. Keep those feet elevated and follow the doctor's orders." He turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Harper, I was hoping to speak with you about some supplies I need ordered, special items that will take some time to come in. Would you have a moment?" "Of course," Eleanor said, looking puzzled but following him toward the door. "Josephine, we will be just downstairs if you need anything." After they left, Josephine tried not to feel disappointed. She had hoped to talk with him more, to learn more about his life in the mountains. She had dozens of questions she wanted to ask, but he had come to check on her as promised, and that was kind enough. She had no claim on his time or attention. About 20 minutes later, Eleanor returned alone, her eyes bright with unshed tears and her hand pressed to her chest. "Aunt Eleanor, what is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," her aunt said, her voice trembling. "Everything is very much right. Josephine, that man just paid off the entire mortgage on my store." Josephine stared at her. "What?" "He went to the bank and he paid the full amount owed. Not just this month's payment, but the entire remaining balance. $215. Eleanor sat down heavily in a chair, looking dazed. "He said it was payment for supplies he needed ordered, but we both know that is not true. No one needs $200 worth of special ordered supplies." "He cannot have done that," Josephine whispered, her mind reeling. "That is an enormous sum." "He did it. Mr. Carlson from the bank came by himself to tell me. The deed is clear. I own the building outright now." Eleanor wiped at her eyes. "I tried to thank him, but he just said that you had walked 20 miles to save your family's store, and the least he could do was make sure you had not walked for nothing. Then he left." "Left? Where did he go?" "Back to his cabin, I assume. He said he had everything he needed, and there was no reason to linger in town." Josephine felt as though the world had tilted sideways. An hour ago, she'd been trying to accept that she would likely never see Dalton Quinn again, and now he had upended everything with an act of generosity so profound she could barely comprehend it. "I have to thank him," she said, starting to push herself up. "Absolutely not," Eleanor said firmly, crossing to press her back down. "You are staying in that bed. Besides, he is already gone. Samuel at the livery said he saw him riding north an hour ago." Josephine laid back, frustration and confusion warring inside her. "Why would he do that? He does not know us. That money could take him years to earn back." "I do not pretend to understand the man's reasoning," Eleanor said gently, "but I saw the way he looked at you yesterday, and again this morning. I think perhaps you made quite an impression on him, dear one." "So he paid $200? That is insane. Love makes people do insane things." "It is not love," Josephine protested. "We only just met." But even as she said it, she remembered the feeling of safety in his arms, the way her heart had beat faster when he said he wanted to know her better. She'd known him for less than a day, but something had sparked between them in that brief time, something she had never felt before. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Eleanor was giddy with relief, making plans for improvements to the store now that she was not drowning in debt. Neighbors came by after word spread about the mortgage being paid, and everyone wanted to know about the mysterious mountain man who had saved the Harper store. Josephine answered questions as best she could, but her mind kept drifting north, to a cabin in the mountains 15 miles away. That evening, as Eleanor helped her into a chair by the window so she could look out over the town, Josephine made a decision. "I want to see him again," she said. Eleanor looked up from where she was adjusting pillows. "The doctor said 2 weeks before you can walk. Then in 2 weeks I want to go to his cabin. I need to thank him properly." "Josephine, that cabin is 15 miles into rough country. You cannot make that journey alone even after you have healed. Then come with me, or I will hire someone to take me. But I am going." Eleanor studied her niece's face and seemed to understand that arguing would be pointless. "Let us see how you heal first. Then we will discuss it." The next 2 weeks were the longest of Josephine's life. Her feet healed slowly, the blisters scabbing over and the torn skin gradually mending. Dr. Morrison visited twice more and pronounced her progress satisfactory, though he maintained his instruction that she stay off her feet as much as possible. Eleanor kept her busy helping with the store's bookkeeping and inventory, work that could be done from a chair. Josephine learned the ins and outs of the business, and she found she had a knack for numbers and organization. More than that, she enjoyed feeling useful, contributing something meaningful. But every night, her thoughts turned to Dalton Quinn. She wondered what he was doing in his mountain cabin, whether he thought about her at all, whether he regretted his impulsive act of generosity. She tried to tell herself that her desire to see him was purely about gratitude, but she knew she was lying to herself. On the 10th day, Josephine took her first tentative steps around the apartment, and while her feet were tender, they held her weight. By the 12th day, she was walking around the store, and by the 14th, she was ready to make the journey. Eleanor had enlisted the help of Thomas Whitfield, a kind older man who owned a small ranch outside of town and occasionally guided hunting parties into the mountains. He knew where Dalton's cabin was and agreed to take them up the following morning. Josephine barely slept that night. She had chosen her best dress, a deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and she had borrowed Eleanor's good boots, which actually fit properly. She washed and braided her hair, then decided she liked it better loose, then braided it again. She felt like a nervous girl preparing for her first dance, which was ridiculous. She was 22 years old and going to thank a man for a generous act. Nothing more. Thomas arrived at dawn with a sturdy wagon and a gentle demeanor. He was in his 60s, weathered and wise, and he spent the first part of the journey telling stories about the early days of Muskogee. Eleanor had packed a basket of supplies as a gift for Dalton, things she knew he might need, practical items like coffee, flour, sugar, and dried beans, along with fresh bread she had baked that morning. The trail north wound through increasingly rugged terrain, climbing into the foothills of the mountains. The forest here was dense and old, with towering oaks and pines that filtered the sunlight into a soft green glow. Birds sang from the branches, and once they spotted a deer watching them from between the trees before it bounded away. "Dalton Quinn is a good man," Thomas said as they jounced along. "Keeps to himself mostly, but he has helped more than a few folks in these parts. Tracked down lost children, shared meat when times were hard, helped rebuild houses after the tornado 2 years back. Never asks for anything in return." "Why does he live so isolated?" Josephine asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a fallen log. "Some men need the wilderness to make sense of the world. Dalton served in the war, saw terrible things. I think the mountains give him peace. Plus, he is half Shawnee on his mother's side. That makes things complicated in some circles, though he could pass for white if he wanted to hide it. He does not hide it, though. He is proud of his heritage." That explained the darker cast to his skin and the way he moved, that fluid grace that seemed so connected to the land around him. Josephine found herself even more intrigued. They had been traveling for nearly 3 hours when the cabin came into view. It was larger than Josephine had expected, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. It sat in a clearing beside a creek with a small barn and corral behind it. The setting was beautiful, surrounded by forest with mountains rising in the distance. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as they pulled into the clearing, Dalton emerged from the cabin. He was dressed in buckskins today, and he wore that long knife Thomas had mentioned strapped to his hip. His hair was loose around his shoulders, and even from a distance, Josephine could see the moment he recognized her. He stood very still as Thomas brought the wagon to a stop. Josephine climbed down before anyone could help her, eager to prove her feet had healed, and walked toward him. His eyes tracked her every movement, and she could not read his expression. "Hello, Dalton," she said when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. "Josephine." His voice was rough, as though he had not used it much in the past 2 weeks. "What are you doing here?" "I came to thank you for what you did." "No thanks necessary. I told your aunt that." "Well, I needed to say it anyway. What you did was incredibly generous. You saved my aunt's livelihood and legacy. I cannot ever repay you." "I do not want repayment." "Then what do you want?" The question came out more direct than she had intended. Dalton looked past her to where Eleanor and Thomas waited by the wagon, clearly trying to give them privacy while still being present as chaperones. He seemed to be struggling with something internal, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I want to know why a woman who walked herself nearly to death keeps invading my thoughts. I want to understand why I spent $200 without a second thought if it meant you would not have made that walk for nothing." He took a step closer. "I want to know if you felt it too, that moment when I held you in my arms, because it has been driving me half mad trying to convince myself I imagined it." Josephine's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. You did not imagine it. Something fierce and triumphant flashed in his eyes. Then why are you really here, Josephine? Because I have been thinking about you every day for 2 weeks. Because I needed to see you again, even though I told myself it was just about gratitude. Because when you carried me that last mile, I felt safer than I have ever felt in my life, and I cannot stop wondering what it would be like to feel that way again. Dalton reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone with surprising gentleness. "This is crazy," he said. "I do not court women. I do not know how to do this." "I do not need courting," Josephine said, leaning into his touch. "I just need honesty." "Then honestly, I have not stopped thinking about you since the moment I saw you collapsed on that road. Honestly, I want to spend more time with you and see if this feeling grows or fades. Honestly, I am terrified because my life is not easy, and the idea of bringing someone into it feels selfish." "Let me decide what is selfish and what is not," Josephine said. "I am not a delicate flower that needs protecting from reality." He almost smiled at that. "No, you are definitely not delicate." Eleanor cleared her throat gently from behind them, and they both turned. "Perhaps we could all go inside and have some coffee while we figure out what happens next," she suggested diplomatically. The interior of Dalton's cabin was surprisingly well appointed. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. Furs and woven blankets added warmth and color, and the furniture, while simple, was well crafted. A loft above held what was presumably his sleeping area, and a closed door led to what might have been storage or another room. Everything was neat and orderly, which somehow did not surprise Josephine. Dalton seemed like a man who would keep his space organized. He made coffee while they settled around the rough-hewn table, and Eleanor unpacked the basket she had brought. Dalton's eyes softened when he saw the supplies. "You did not need to do this," he said. "Of course I did," Eleanor replied. "It is barely a token compared to what you did for us, but I wanted you to have something." They talked for a while, the conversation surprisingly easy despite the unusual circumstances. Thomas and Dalton discussed hunting and weather patterns, while Eleanor asked about the cabin and how long Dalton had lived there. Josephine mostly listened, content to watch Dalton in his own environment. He was more relaxed here, she noticed, less guarded. When he moved around the cabin, every motion was economical and sure. This was clearly a man completely comfortable in his space, confident in his ability to provide for himself and handle whatever challenges arose. After about an hour, Eleanor and Thomas excused themselves to walk down to the creek, giving Josephine and Dalton privacy while still remaining within shouting distance for propriety's sake. Alone with him, Josephine felt suddenly nervous. Dalton seemed to sense this and gestured to the door. "Would you like to see the rest of the property?" They walked together toward the barn, where Dalton kept his horses, the pack mule, and a milk cow. He showed her the garden he maintained, the root cellar where he stored vegetables and preserved meat, the workshop where he tanned hides and did repairs. Everything spoke of self-sufficiency and skill. "You have built a good life here," Josephine said, running her hand along the fence rail of the corral. "It is a simple life, but it suits me." He leaned against the fence beside her. "After the war, I tried to go back to living in towns, but I could not settle. Too many people, too much noise, too many expectations about who I should be and how I should act. My mother's people taught me how to live off the land, and Samuel, the old trapper who partnered with me, taught me the rest. This life makes sense to me in a way civilization never did." "Do you ever get lonely?" "Sometimes, especially in winter when the snows come and I might not see another person for weeks." He turned to look at her. "But loneliness is better than being surrounded by people and still feeling alone, which is what I felt in the army and in the cities after." Josephine understood that distinction. She had felt alone most of her life, surrounded by family who loved her, but never quite understood her restlessness, her desire for something more than the narrow path expected of her. "What do you want from your life, Josephine?" Dalton asked. "Truly want, not what others expect of you." It was a question no one had ever asked her before. She thought about it carefully before answering. "I want to feel useful, like the work I do matters. I want freedom to make my own choices. I want to wake up in the morning excited about the day rather than dreading the same dull routine." She paused. And I want to love someone who sees me as an equal partner, not a decoration or a servant. Those are not small things you want. No, but I do not think we only get one life to live small. Dalton reached out and took her hand, his fingers engulfing hers. The touch sent warmth racing up her arm. I cannot offer you an easy life, Josephine. Living here means hard work, isolation, and dangers you probably cannot even imagine. But I can offer you partnership. I can offer you purpose and freedom and a life that is never dull. Are you asking me something? Her heart was racing again. I am saying that if you want to know if this connection between us is real or just a moment of intensity born from circumstances, then come visit again. And again after that. Let us see if what we feel grows or fades. And if it grows, then yes, I'm asking something. Josephine knew this was impulsive and probably foolish. She had known this man for barely a day total, even if he had occupied her thoughts constantly for 2 weeks. But when she looked at him, when she felt the solid warmth of his hand holding hers, when she imagined the possibility of a life lived on her own terms with a partner who valued her strength rather than trying to diminish it, she felt something click into place deep in her chest. I would like that, she said. I would like to come back. The smile that spread across Dalton's face transformed him completely. It erased years of hardship and loneliness from his features and made him look almost boyish despite his size and weathered appearance. When? He asked. As soon as I can convince Thomas to bring me again, or I will find another way if he cannot. I will come to town next week. We can arrange a time. They stood there holding hands, smiling at each other like fools, until Eleanor's voice called out that they should probably start back if they wanted to reach Muskogee before dark. The ride back to town felt both longer and shorter than the journey there. Josephine's mind whirled with possibilities and plans. Eleanor watched her with a mixture of concern and amusement, but said nothing until they were back at the apartment that evening. Are you certain about this? Her aunt asked gently as they prepared for bed. That's a very different life than what you have known. I'm not certain about anything, Josephine admitted, but I'm willing to find out. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm choosing my own path rather than following the one laid out for me. That has to mean something. Eleanor hugged her tightly. Then I support you. Just promise me you will be careful and smart about this. Take your time to know him properly. I promise. Dalton came to town the following week, as promised, and they spent the afternoon walking around Muskogee together, properly chaperoned by Eleanor. He was clearly uncomfortable in town, his shoulders tense and his eyes constantly scanning as though looking for threats. But he relaxed when talking with Josephine, and she learned more about his life. He told her about growing up split between 2 worlds, with a Shawnee mother and an Irish father who had loved each other deeply despite the prejudices they faced. He told her about losing them both to cholera when he was 16, about joining the army 2 years later because he had nowhere else to go, about the horrors of war that still sometimes woke him in the night. He told her about Samuel Gray Wolfe, the old Shawnee trapper who had taken him under his wing and taught him to live in harmony with the land rather than in constant conflict. In turn, Josephine told him about her own life, about growing up as the middle child in a family of 7, often overlooked and underestimated, about her love of books and learning that was considered unfeminine and discouraged, about the restlessness that had always lived inside her, the feeling that there was more to life than the small box she had been placed in. You should have been born a man, Dalton said at one point. You have the spirit of an explorer. No, Josephine said firmly. I should have been born into a world where women are allowed to be explorers too. There's a difference. He considered that, and then nodded. You are right. I apologize. I'm still learning. The fact that he could admit that he could acknowledge his own limitations and be willing to grow, made her respect him even more. They established a pattern over the following weeks. Dalton would come to town every 7 to 10 days, and Josephine would visit his cabin on alternating weeks. Eleanor or Thomas always accompanied her to his cabin, though they gave them privacy while remaining as chaperones. During these visits, Dalton taught Josephine skills she had never imagined learning. He showed her how to fish in the creek, how to identify edible plants, how to read tracks in the soft earth. He taught her to shoot, first with a rifle, and then with the pistol he insisted she carry when she visited. He was a patient teacher, never mocking her mistakes, always encouraging her progress. Josephine discovered she loved this new knowledge. There was something deeply satisfying about learning practical skills, about becoming more self-sufficient. She found she had good aim with a gun and quick reflexes. She learned to move more quietly through the forest, to observe the natural world around her. She also helped him with things around the cabin. She organized his stores, showing him how to track inventory better. She helped him plan meals and showed him better ways to prepare certain foods. She mended clothes and helped tan leather, finding satisfaction in the tangible results of her work. Summer moved into early fall, and the relationship between them deepened with each visit. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. They laughed together, worked together, occasionally argued when they disagreed about something, and learned each other's rhythms and patterns. Dalton was learning to be less solitary, to share his space and his thoughts with another person. Josephine was learning about her own strength, discovering that she was far more capable than she had ever believed. And somewhere along the way, probably during long conversations by the fire or quiet moments working side by side, they fell completely in love. It was Josephine who said it first. They were sitting on his porch one evening in late September, watching the sun set over the mountains. The air had turned crisp with the approaching autumn, and Dalton had draped a blanket around her shoulders. She was tucked against his side, his arm around her waist, and everything felt perfectly right. "I love you," she said quietly, not looking at him, suddenly afraid she had spoken too soon. Dalton was silent for a long moment, and her heart began to sink. Then, he tightened his arm around her and pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I have loved you since you told me you could ride when you could barely stand," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been waiting for you to catch up." She turned in his arms to look up at him, and the expression on his face stole her breath. It was open and vulnerable and full of devotion. "Then ask me," she whispered. "Ask you what?" "What you have been wanting to ask for weeks now. I see it in your eyes every time we say goodbye." Dalton slid off the bench to one knee, taking both her hands in his. "Josephine Harper, will you marry me? Will you take on this hard, isolated life with me? Will you be my partner and my love and the reason I greet each morning with gratitude?" "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes to all of it." He stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her dizzy. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Josephine laughed with pure joy. "When?" she asked. "As soon as you want. Tomorrow, if you agree. We need to do this properly. Eleanor will want to be there, and we need to give notice at the church." 2 weeks, then. I cannot wait longer than that." 2 weeks, she agreed. They were married on a bright October morning in the small church in Muskogee. Josephine wore a simple cream-colored dress that Eleanor had helped her make, and she carried wildflowers that Dalton had picked that morning from the meadow near his cabin. He wore new buckskins that he had made himself, and he had trimmed his beard and tied his hair back neatly. The ceremony was small, attended by Eleanor, Thomas, and his wife, Dr. Morrison, and a few of the townspeople who had gotten to know Dalton through his visits. The preacher spoke about partnership and devotion, and when Dalton said his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to protect you while respecting your strength. I promise to listen to you and value your opinions. I promise to share my life, my heart, and my home with you for as long as I draw breath." Josephine's vows were equally heartfelt. "I promise to stand beside you, not behind you. I promise to work alongside you and help build a life we both can take pride in. I promise to love you in the easy times and the difficult ones, for as long as I live." When the preacher pronounced them married, Dalton kissed her thoroughly, drawing laughs and cheers from their small group of witnesses. They celebrated with a modest meal at Eleanor's apartment, and then, as afternoon was turning to evening, Dalton lifted Josephine into his arms and carried her down to where his horse waited. "I can walk," she protested, laughing. "I know you can, but I carried you the last mile when we met, and I wanted to carry you into our future too." He settled her in the saddle and mounted behind her, pulling her back against his chest just as he had that first day. "Besides, I like holding you." They rode through the twilight toward the mountains, toward the cabin that was now their home. The forest was alive with the sounds of evening, and the air smelled of pine and approaching winter. When they crested the final ridge and the cabin came into view, warm lamplight glowing in the windows, Josephine felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she was meant to be. This life, this man, this adventure. Dalton had prepared for her arrival. There were fresh flowers on the table, and he had built new shelves for her books. He had even built a privacy screen around the bed in the loft, creating a more intimate space. That first night as husband and wife was tender and passionate, both of them nervous and eager. Dalton was gentle with her, taking his time, making sure she felt cherished and safe. Josephine marveled at the way such a powerful man could be so careful, so attentive to her needs and comfort. Afterwards, wrapped in his arms beneath layers of warm blankets, she felt happier than she had ever been. "No regrets?" Dalton murmured against her hair. "None. You." "Not a single one." The first weeks of married life brought adjustments for both of them. Josephine had to learn the rhythms of mountain living, the constant work required to maintain their home and prepare for winter. There was wood to chop and stack, food to preserve, repairs to make before the first snows came. She had never worked so hard in her life, and she loved it. Every night she fell into bed exhausted but satisfied, knowing that her efforts directly contributed to their survival and comfort. There was no pretense here, no performing for society's expectations, just honest work and honest living. Dalton, in turn, had to adjust to sharing his space and his life. He was used to solitude and doing things his own way, and sometimes he forgot to explain what he was doing or why. They had their first real argument when he went hunting without telling her and was gone for 2 days. She had been terrified something had happened to him. "I have done this 100 times," he said, frustrated. "I always tell myself when I will be back." "But you did not tell me. I am your wife now, Dalton. You cannot just disappear." He stared at her, and then understanding dawned on his face. "You are right. I am sorry. I am so used to being alone, I did not think. It will not happen again." And it did not. He learned to communicate better, to include her in his plans and decisions. She learned to trust in his skills and not panic at the first sign of difficulty. By the time the first snow fell in mid-November, they had settled into a partnership that felt natural and strong. The long winter months that Dalton had warned her about did not feel isolating with Josephine there. They spent evenings by the fire, reading aloud from the books she had brought, teaching each other skills, talking about their dreams for the future. Dalton taught her to sew leather and work with furs. Josephine taught him numbers and bookkeeping, showing him how he could get better prices for his goods if he kept better records and negotiated more effectively. They were snowed in for nearly 2 weeks in January, and rather than feeling trapped, they reveled in the forced intimacy. They made love often, learning each other's bodies and desires. They cooked elaborate meals from their stores just for the pleasure of creation. They built snow sculptures in the clearing and had snowball fights that always ended with them tumbling into a drift, laughing. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it brought transformation. The snow melted, revealing the first green shoots. Animals emerged from hibernation. The creek that ran beside the cabin swelled with runoff. In March, Josephine realized she had missed her monthly courses. By April, Dr. Morrison confirmed what she already knew. She was pregnant. Dalton's reaction when she told him was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully as though she might break. "Are you happy?" she asked, laughing at his sudden concern. Happy does not cover it. Terrified, overjoyed, amazed, all of those things. He placed his hand carefully on her still flat stomach. "A child. Our child. Are you disappointed it is happening so soon? I know we have not been married long." "I'm not disappointed about anything. I'm just hoping I know how to be a good father." "You will be wonderful," Josephine said with complete confidence. "You are strong and kind and patient. Any child would be lucky to have you as a father." Over the following months, Josephine bloomed. Dalton became even more protective, constantly worrying about her working too hard or lifting too much. She had to remind him frequently that pregnancy was not an illness and that she was perfectly capable. They made plans for the future, talking about how they would need to expand the cabin to add a room for the child. Dalton began working on the addition in his spare time, determined to have it finished before winter returned. In late October, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Josephine went into labor. Eleanor had come to stay for the birth, arriving 2 weeks early to be certain she was there. Dr. Morrison had promised to come when word was sent, but the baby had ideas of its own. The labor was long and difficult. For hours, Josephine worked through the pain while Eleanor helped her and Dalton paced outside, unable to sit still. When he heard Josephine cry out, he burst through the door, despite Eleanor's protests. "I should be with her," he insisted, going to her side. Josephine reached for his hand, squeezing it hard during a contraction. "Stay," she gasped. "Please stay." So he stayed, supporting her through each wave of pain, whispering encouragement, not flinching, even when she squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt. Finally, as dawn was breaking, their son was born. He came into the world squalling and healthy, with dark hair and his father's strong features. Dalton held him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are amazing. Look what you did." They named him Daniel Henry Quinn, and from the moment of his birth, he was the center of their world. Dalton proved to be a devoted father, patient with the baby's cries in the night, eager to learn how to care for this tiny person. He built a beautiful cradle from carved wood and fashioned soft toys from leather scraps. Josephine discovered that she loved being a mother, though it was harder than she had imagined. The sleepless nights, the constant demands, the worry that she was doing everything wrong. But when Daniel smiled at her for the first time, when he reached his tiny hand toward her face, when he fell asleep content in her arms, all the difficulties faded away. Eleanor stayed for a month after the birth, helping Josephine recover and learn to care for the baby. Before she left, she pulled her niece aside. "You have built something beautiful here," she said. "I worried at first that you were making a mistake, but I see now how wrong I was. You and Dalton are perfect together. This is where you belong." After Eleanor left, Josephine felt a brief moment of sadness, but it passed quickly because she had everything she needed right here: her husband, her son, her home. The seasons continued their cycle. Daniel grew from a baby to a toddler, learning to walk and talk. He had his father's love for the outdoors and would toddle around the clearing, examining every rock and leaf with intense fascination. Dalton taught him to be gentle with animals and to respect the forest. When Daniel was 2, Josephine became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and when their daughter was born in the spring, the birth was faster. They named her Lily Margaret, and she had her mother's eyes and a temperament that was pure determination from day one. Their family was complete. 2 children, healthy and happy, a marriage built on respect and love, a home that was everything they had dreamed of. Over the years, they made occasional trips to Muskogee. The children loved visiting Aunt Eleanor, who spoiled them with sweets and toys. But they were always eager to return to the mountains, to their cabin in the creek, and the endless adventures of the forest. Dalton continued his work as a trapper and hunter, and Josephine managed their household and took on much of the business side of things, corresponding with buyers and negotiating contracts. She had been right when she told him she could help him get better prices, and their income had improved significantly. They added onto the cabin twice more over the years, creating separate rooms for the children and a larger workspace. The place that had once been a solitary man's simple shelter became a real family home, filled with laughter and life. Daniel grew into a strong young man who shared his father's love for the wilderness. He learned to track and hunt, to trap and fish, to read the signs of weather and seasons. But he also inherited his mother's love of learning, and Josephine taught him to read and write, to do mathematics, to think critically about the world. Lily was fierce and independent, refusing to be left behind when her brother and father went on expeditions. She learned to shoot as well as any boy, to ride fearlessly, to stand up for herself. She was her mother's daughter in every way. As the years passed, Josephine and Dalton's love only deepened. They had weathered storms together, both literal and figurative. They had nursed each other through illnesses, supported each other through doubts, celebrated each other's triumphs. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and they sat together on the porch, Dalton would pull Josephine close and remind her of the day they met. "You were the most stubborn woman I had ever seen," he would say. "Collapsed on the road but still insisting you could make it." "And you were the most overbearing man I had ever met," she would reply, teasing. "Picking me up without asking permission. Best decision I ever made, carrying you that last mile. Best decision I ever made, letting you. On their 20th anniversary, their children now grown, they took a trip back to the spot where they had first met. The road looked different now, more traveled and better maintained, but the memory was as vivid as ever. "Do you ever regret it?" Dalton asked, standing where he had found her that day. "Giving up the possibility of an easier life?" Josephine looked at her husband, at the silver now threading through his dark hair, at the lines around his eyes from years of smiling, at the hands that had held her with such care for 2 decades. She thought about their children, about the home they had built together, about the life she had chosen. "Never," she said firmly, "not for one single moment." They had built something rare and precious, a partnership of equals, a love that had been tested and proven strong, a family that thrived in the wilderness. As they rode back to their cabin that evening, the sun setting behind the mountains and casting everything in golden light, Josephine thought about that terrified, desperate young woman who had walked 20 miles in worn-out boots. She had been searching for a way to save her aunt's store, but she had found so much more. She had found home. She had found purpose. She had found a love that transformed her entire world. And it had all started when a mountain man with blue-green eyes and gentle hands had carried her that last mile in his arms. Years continued to pass in the mountains. Daniel eventually married a strong-willed young woman from a neighboring settlement, a schoolteacher named Sarah who was not afraid of the wilderness. They built their own cabin about 3 miles from Dalton and Josephine's place, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to have their own space. Lily remained fiercely independent well into her 20s, refusing several marriage proposals before finally meeting a man she considered her equal. He was a surveyor from the territorial office, and he respected her knowledge of the land and her capabilities. They split their time between his work in Muskogee and her family's mountain home. Grandchildren came, first from Daniel and Sarah, then from Lily and her husband. The cabin that had once been so quiet filled regularly with the sounds of children playing, the family gathering for meals and celebrations. Eleanor lived to see her great-nieces and great-nephews, though age eventually slowed her down. When she could no longer manage the store alone, she sold it, but kept her apartment in town. She spent her final years moving between Josephine's mountain home and Lily's house in Muskogee, surrounded by family, content with how her life had unfolded. When she passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, Josephine grieved deeply. But she was grateful that her aunt had lived to see how well everything had turned out, that her act of desperation walking those 20 miles had led to such abundance. Dalton remained strong and vital well into his 60s, though he no longer trapped as extensively as he once had. He taught his grandchildren the skills he had once taught his own children, patient and kind with each one. He was known throughout the region as a man of wisdom and integrity, someone whose counsel was sought and respected. Josephine thrived as well, her mind sharp and her spirit undimmed by age. She maintained correspondence with people throughout the territory, kept meticulous records of their family history, and wrote detailed journals about their life in the mountains. She wanted future generations to understand the choices they had made and the life they had built. On their 40th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the cabin for a celebration. There was food and music and laughter, stories told and memories shared. At one point, Daniel asked his parents to tell the story of how they met, and even though everyone had heard it countless times, they all gathered around to listen again. Dalton and Josephine sat together on the porch, her hand in his, and took turns telling the tale. About the stolen money and the desperate walk, about collapsing on the road, about the mountain man who stopped to help, about the last mile carried in strong arms, about the $200 that saved a store and changed 2 lives forever. "The best thing that ever happened to me was running out of strength on that road," Josephine said, squeezing Dalton's hand, "because it led me to the strongest man I have ever known." "The best thing that ever happened to me was deciding to come to town a day early that week," Dalton replied, "because it put me on that road at exactly the right moment to find you." As the sun set over their mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Josephine reflected on the extraordinary life she had lived. She had walked away from everything expected of her and into an unknown future. She had taken risks and made unconventional choices, She had worked harder than she ever imagined possible and loved more deeply than she had known was possible. And it all traced back to one man's kindness, to strong arms that had carried her when she could no longer carry herself, to a split-second decision to trust a stranger. That night, after their family had finally departed and the cabin was quiet again, Dalton and Josephine lay together in the bed they had shared for 40 years. The moon was full, casting silver light through the window, and they could hear the familiar sounds of the forest settling in for the night. "I would do it all again," Josephine whispered into the darkness. "Every difficult moment, every challenge, every sacrifice. I would walk those 20 miles again if it meant ending up here with you." Dalton pulled her closer, his arms still strong despite the years. "I would search every road in the territory if it meant finding you." They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by the life they had built together. When Dalton passed away at the age of 73 after a brief illness, Josephine grieved but did not break. He had lived a full, rich life and had died peacefully with his family around him. She took comfort in knowing that he had been happy, that their life together had given him the peace he had searched for after the war. She remained in the cabin for another 5 years, refusing to move to town despite her children's concerns. This was her home, the place she and Dalton had built together, and she was not ready to leave it. On a warm spring morning, surrounded by wildflowers that reminded her of her wedding bouquet, Josephine Harper Quinn passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 76. She was found by her granddaughter, still clutching one of Dalton's old leather journals. They buried her beside Dalton on the hillside overlooking the cabin, with the mountains rising behind, and the creek singing its eternal song below. The entire community came to pay their respects, people from Muskogee and beyond, all whose lives had been touched by this remarkable couple. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations. It was carefully maintained, expanded and modernized over time, but never fundamentally changed. Each generation told the story to the next, about the woman who walked 20 miles in worn-out boots and the mountain man who carried her the last mile in his arms. It became family legend, a testament to the power of kindness and the courage to choose your own path. It was a reminder that the best things in life often come when you are at your lowest point, when you have pushed yourself to the limit and beyond, when you finally allow yourself to be vulnerable and accept help. Josephine and Dalton's story lived on in their descendants, in the values they passed down, in the lessons they taught about strength and partnership and love. Their journals and letters were preserved, offering glimpses into a life fully lived, a love fully realized. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slants just right through the trees and the air is filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers, those who visit the old cabin swear they can feel the presence of that love still lingering there, strong and enduring, a testament to what two people can build when they choose each other against all odds. The story that began with exhaustion and desperation, with worn-out boots and the last reserves of strength, had become a story of triumph and joy. It proved that sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations, and that being carried when you cannot walk is not weakness but wisdom. Josephine had set out to save her aunt's store, but she had saved herself in the process. She had found not just love but purpose, not just a husband but a true partner, not just a home but a legacy. And all because she had walked 20 miles in worn-out boots, and a mountain man with kind eyes and strong arms had been there to carry her that last crucial mile. The end of their mortal story was not an ending at all, but a continuation in the lives they had touched, the children they had raised, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their values forward into new generations. Love like theirs did not die. It transformed, evolved, spread outward like ripples on water. In the cabin that Dalton had built and Josephine had made into a home, in the mountains that had witnessed their love story unfold, their spirits remained. Not as ghosts, but as echoes, as the feeling of rightness that filled anyone who stood in that place, as the understanding that here, two people had loved completely and built a life of meaning and purpose. Their story was complete, their ending perfect, not because it was without pain or loss, but because it was full. They had lived fully, loved deeply, created abundantly. They had faced challenges and overcome them together. They had built something that lasted far beyond their own years. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Dalton Quinn was surely waiting with strong arms outstretched, ready once more to carry his beloved Josephine through whatever adventures lay ahead. Because that was the promise they had made to each other 40 years ago, standing in a small church in Muskogee. To love each other for as long as they lived, and perhaps, if such things are possible, even beyond.